Welcome, dear listener, to another tranquil journey through the often unsettling corridors of history. As you find comfort in your preferred haven of rest, and we prepare to delve into the shadowy recesses of tonight's exploration of ancient Egypt, I warmly invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what hour the day or night holds for you. It is always a source of quiet encouragement to feel the reach of our global community of nocturnal scholars. If these calm, yet unvarnished, explorations of bygone eras bring you a measure of peace or intrigue, do consider subscribing. You'll join a growing fellowship of history enthusiasts who seek a restful passage into sleep, accompanied by tales from the past. Tonight, we venture not into the gilded tombs of pharaohs, nor the grand temples that still defy the sands of time. Instead, we turn our gaze to a more sombre, far less documented, yet profoundly human experience, the disturbing world of mummification for the common souls of ancient Egypt. Our journey begins by trying to comprehend the immense psychological weight carried by these ordinary individuals, the pervasive dread of oblivion intertwined with a desperate, almost primal, hope for an existence beyond the veil of death. This was not a casual belief, but an all-consuming concern that shaped life and, most certainly, dictated the grim realities surrounding its end for the vast majority. The afterlife, in the ancient Egyptian worldview, was not a mere ethereal dream, but a tangible, continued existence. To the farmer toiling under the relentless sun, the craftsman labouring in a dusty workshop, or the woman managing a modest household, the promise of the duat, the underworld, and the field of reeds beyond, was as real as the Nile's annual flood. Death was not an ending, but a perilous transition, a journey fraught with trials, leading, if successful, to an eternity of peace and plenty, a mirror of the best of earthly life, but without its suffering. Yet this promise was conditional, heavily dependent on the preservation of the physical form, the cut, and the careful observance of intricate rituals. The body was the anchor for the soul, the vessel for the ka and ba, the spiritual essences that needed to reunite with the preserved corpse to achieve eternal life. For the commoner, this fundamental tenet of their faith became a source of profound and unrelenting anxiety. While the pharaohs and the elite could command vast resources, employing skilled priests and artisans, utilizing the finest materials for their elaborate embalming and magnificent tombs, the ordinary Egyptian faced a starkly different reality. They lived with the constant, gnawing awareness that their means were pitifully inadequate to meet the idealized standards of a good burial, the kind that supposedly guaranteed a smooth passage and a blessed afterlife. This wasn't merely about envy of the rich. It was a deep-seated fear that their inability to afford the proper rites would condemn them to a second, more terrifying death, an utter annihilation of being, or worse, an eternity wandering as a tormented, unfulfilled spirit. Imagine the weight of this belief in a society where life itself was often harsh and precarious. Disease was rampant, infant mortality heartbreakingly common, and life expectancy, even for adults, far shorter than our own. Every illness, every injury, every period of famine would not only be a struggle for earthly survival, but also a terrifying reminder of their unpreparedness for the inevitable journey beyond. The depictions of the weighing of the heart ceremony, where the deceased's heart was judged against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order, were ubiquitous. Failure in this judgment meant being devoured by Amit, the monstrous devourer of the dead, a grotesque chimera of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. For a commoner, the fear that their modest life, and consequently their modest burial, would not measure up on those divine scales, must have been a constant underlying dread. This dread, however, was not paralyzing. It was a catalyst for a desperate, almost frantic hope. If one could not afford the elaborate 70-day mummification process performed in the pristine waybit, the pure place of the embalmers, then one had to find alternatives. This desperation fueled a whole spectrum of makeshift practices, compromises, and a reliance on less effective, sometimes even detrimental, methods. It meant families would scrape together every meagre coin, every usable scrap of linen, every humble offering they could muster, all in the faint hope that it might be enough to appease the gods and secure a place for their loved ones in the field of reeds. This wasn't just personal salvation, it was a familial and societal obligation. To neglect the dead, to fail to provide them with even the semblance of a proper burial, was a profound failing, risking not only the deceased's eternal prospects, but also potentially bringing misfortune upon the living. The air in a commoner's village, therefore, was thick, not only with the smells of daily life, of cooking fires, animals, and the ever-present dust, but also with this unspoken, yet deeply felt, spiritual anxiety. The rituals and beliefs surrounding death were not confined to the moments of passing. They permeated everyday existence. Amulets, however crudely fashioned, would be hoarded. Prayers and small offerings to local deities would be made with a fervency born of fear as much as faith. The stories of what lay beyond, of the terrors and the glories, would be told and retold, reinforcing both the immense desire for an afterlife and the crushing awareness of their limited ability to guarantee it. This pervasive dread, this desperate yearning for a continuity of being, set the stage for the often grim and unsettling realities of how ordinary Egyptians faced death and the stark compromises they were forced to make in their pursuit of eternity. A pursuit often hindered by the very means intended to aid it. The gap between the theological ideal of resurrection and the material, often squalid, reality of their mummification process was a chasm filled with untold suffering and a quiet desperation that echoes through the millennia. The moments following a death in a commoner's household were a stark departure from the solemn, ritualized proceedings depicted in the tombs of the elite. There were no grand lamentations led by professional mourners, no immediate arrival of a retinue of embalmers from the revered House of Beautification. Instead, death arrived in humble, often cramped, mud-brick dwellings, where the realities of life, and therefore death, were immediate, visceral, and overwhelmingly sensory. These were not homes designed for the elaborate processes of preservation. They were spaces shared with animals, filled with the smoke of cooking fires, and often lacking even rudimentary sanitation, creating an environment where the deceased's body began its inexorable journey towards decay with alarming swiftness. Ancient Egypt, for all its monumental achievements, was a land where sickness was a constant companion for the majority of its population. The life-giving Nile, while the source of fertility, also harboured a host of parasites and waterborne diseases like schistosomiasis and guinea worm, evidenced in countless commoner mummies. Bacterial infections, a result of poor hygiene, contaminated food and water, and close living quarters, would have been rampant. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and debilitating dental diseases leading to systemic infections were common killers. For the poor, access to even the most basic forms of medical care, often a mixture of practical remedies and magical incantations, was limited and frequently ineffective against serious ailments. Thus, death was often not a peaceful slipping away in old age, but the culmination of a painful, drawn-out illness, leaving behind an already weakened and ravaged body. In the oppressive heat that characterized much of the Egyptian year, the process of decomposition would commence with horrifying speed. Within hours, the subtle changes would begin. The cooling of the skin, the stiffening of the limbs known as rigor mortis, and then the telltale signs of putrefaction. Livor mortis, the purplish pooling of blood in the lowest lying parts of the body, would become apparent, quickly followed by the bloating caused by the gases produced by internal bacteria feasting on the decaying tissues. The smell, an insidious and pervasive marker of death, would begin to permeate the small, poorly ventilated dwelling, a grim reminder of the urgency and the unpleasantness of the task ahead for the grieving family. Sanitation, or the lack thereof, in commoner settlements, exacerbated the problem exponentially. Waste, both human and animal, was often disposed of haphazardly, attracting swarms of flies and other insects. These creatures, far from being mere nuisances, were potent vectors of disease, and also played a direct role in the decomposition process. Flies would be drawn to the deceased, laying their eggs in orifices and any open wounds. The resulting maggots, while technically aiding in the stripping of flesh, a process that, in a controlled setting, could be part of natural mummification in arid sand, in a domestic, uncontrolled environment, simply accelerated the messy and distressing decay, further contaminating the body and the surrounding area. The family, already burdened by grief, faced the immediate and deeply unsettling challenge of dealing with the corpse in these conditions. There was no refrigerated morgue, no waiting period in a cool, sterile environment. They were in direct contact with the decaying body, exposed to the associated pathogens and the psychological distress of witnessing a loved one's physical form rapidly break down. This direct, unmediated confrontation with the raw realities of decomposition must have been a harrowing experience, a stark contrast to the idealized images of serene, perfectly preserved mummies they might have hoped for. Decisions had to be made quickly. The longer the body remained in the home, the greater the health risks, and the more advanced the decay, making even rudimentary preservation attempts more difficult and less likely to succeed. The urgency was not just practical, it was also spiritual. The belief system dictated that the body needed to be preserved for the Ka and Ba to recognize it. A rapidly decaying corpse threatened this crucial recognition, jeopardizing the deceased's journey to the afterlife. This created immense pressure on the family to act, even if their means were severely limited. The initial cleansing of the body, a ritual precursor to any form of embalming, would have been a grim task under such circumstances. Water itself might be scarce or unclean. The process of washing a body, already showing signs of decomposition, perhaps with skin slippage or open lesions, would have been physically and emotionally repulsive. Any personal items the deceased might have worn, now soiled and potentially contaminated, would need to be removed. All of this would likely be undertaken by close family members, often women, with little to no protection against infection, adding another layer of risk to their grief. The very fabric of the commoner's hut, typically constructed from sun-dried mud bricks and organic materials like reeds or palm fronds, offered little barrier to the elements or pests. The floors were often simple packed earth. This meant that fluids from the decomposing body could seep into the ground, further contaminating the living space. The smell would cling to everything, a persistent and distressing reminder. The stark reality was that the commoner's home, the centre of their life, became an unwilling and ill-equipped antechamber to the underworld, a place where the struggle to preserve a loved one against the relentless forces of nature began under the most challenging and unhygienic conditions imaginable, a far cry from the purified workshops where the elite's journey to eternity commenced. This initial, brutal confrontation with decay set a sombre tone for whatever compromised form of mummification might follow. While the royal embalming workshops, the Waybit, or Pure Place, and the Perna or House of Beautification, operated with a dedicated staff of highly skilled priests, ritual specialists, and craftsmen, the mummification of an ordinary Egyptian fell to a far less visible and considerably less sophisticated network of individuals. These were not the chief lector priests, who recited sacred incantations over pharaohs, nor the sealers, who meticulously managed the vast quantities of natron and linen. For the commoner, the embalmers were often local, part-time practitioners, perhaps individuals who also undertook other grim but necessary tasks within the community, like butchering animals or assisting with difficult births. Their knowledge would have been a passed-down, cruder version of the official techniques learned through apprenticeship or observation, and heavily adapted to the realities of scarce resources and demanding clientele. The workshops of these commoner embalmers, if they could even be called that, were a world away from the sanctified, well-equipped facilities afforded to the elite. Instead of dedicated buildings with channels for draining fluids and separate chambers for different stages of the process, these practitioners likely worked in open-air spaces on the outskirts of villages, perhaps in makeshift shelters constructed from reeds and matting, or even within the deceased's own humble dwelling if no other option was available. The concept of ritual purity, so central to elite embalming, would have been almost impossible to maintain in such environments. Dust, insects, scavenging animals, and the general detritus of everyday life would have been constant contaminants. The tools employed by these individuals were equally rudimentary, often repurposed from other trades, or simply consisting of sharpened stones and basic knives. While official embalmers utilized an array of specialized bronze or flint instruments, knives for incisions, hooks for brain removal, spatulas for applying resins, the commoner's embalmer might make do with a single, less than hygienic blade for multiple tasks. The famous long bronze or iron hooks used to extract the brain through the nose, a delicate and skilled procedure, were likely unavailable or too costly. Brain removal for commoners, if attempted at all, might have involved more brutal methods, such as simply smashing the ethmoid bone and hoping some of the liquefied brain tissue would drain out, or it might have been skipped entirely, leaving the brain to decompose within the skull, a practice that certainly compromised long-term preservation. The level of anatomical knowledge possessed by these local practitioners would have varied wildly, but was generally far inferior to that of the elite embalmers, who, through generations of practice, had gained a significant, if empirically based, understanding of human anatomy. Commoner embalmers were likely working from a simplified, almost formulaic understanding of the body, focusing on the most basic steps of evisceration and desiccation, often with a high degree of imprecision. The precise, small incision on the left flank, described in classical texts for the removal of organs for the elite, might have been a larger, clumsier cut in commoner practice, increasing the risk of damage to the body cavity and complicating the subsequent packing and wrapping. Furthermore, these were not salaried officials of the state or temple. They were independent operators whose livelihood depended on the meagre fees they could extract from impoverished families. This economic pressure inevitably influenced the quality and extent of the services offered. There would have been a constant tension between the family's desire for a proper mummification and the embalmer's need to make a living, leading to corners being cut, cheaper materials being used, and steps being omitted. They might offer a menu of services, with different price points corresponding to varying levels of thoroughness, forcing families into heartbreaking decisions about what aspects of their loved one's eternal preservation they could afford to sacrifice. The social status of these commoner embalmers was also likely ambiguous and low. While elite embalmers, particularly the supervising priests, held respected positions due to their sacred duties, those who handled the dead on a more local, less ritualized level were often viewed with a mixture of necessity and apprehension, if not outright revulsion. Their constant contact with death, decay, and the less savoury aspects of human biology would have made them ritually unclean in the eyes of many, potentially leading to a degree of social marginalisation. They lived on the fringes, both literally in their workplace locations and figuratively in the social hierarchy. This lack of formal training, proper tools, and dedicated, clean facilities meant that the mummification process for commoners was inherently more brutal and less effective. There was likely a higher incidence of errors, such as incomplete removal of organs, leading to accelerated internal decay, or insufficient desiccation, resulting in a damp, poorly preserved mummy. The aesthetic considerations that were paramount in royal mummification, the careful padding of limbs to retain a lifelike form, the intricate application of cosmetics, the attachment of artificial eyes, were almost certainly absent in commoner practices. The goal was more basic, a semblance of preservation, enough to hopefully satisfy the spiritual requirements, rather than the creation of a lasting, idealized image of the deceased. The unseen embalmers of the poor toiled in the shadows of the grand narrative of Egyptian mummification, their crude practices a disturbing testament to the stark inequalities that extended even into the preparations for the afterlife. The careful removal, separate preservation, and ritual entombment of the internal organs, specifically the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, was a cornerstone of elite Egyptian mummification. These organs were considered vital for the deceased's continued existence in the afterlife, each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus and placed within dedicated canopic jars. For the commoner, however, this crucial step in securing an intact eternal self was often subject to brutal compromises, significant simplification, or even complete omission, dictated by economic necessity and the limited skills of their embalmers. In the idealized process, a skilled embalmer would make a precise incision, typically on the left flank, and carefully extract the viscera, leaving the heart in place, as it was believed to be the seat of intellect and emotion, essential for the judgment in the afterlife. Each organ would then be individually cleaned, dried with natron, anointed with oils and resins, and wrapped in linen before being placed into its respective canopic jar, inscribed with protective spells. This meticulous procedure was time-consuming and required specific materials and ritual knowledge, all of which came at a considerable cost. For the ordinary Egyptian, this level of care was often an unattainable luxury. When evisceration was performed, and it wasn't always, it was likely a much cruder affair. The incision might be clumsier, larger, and made with less precision, risking unnecessary damage to the body cavity. The extraction itself might be less thorough, with remnants of organs or associated tissues left behind, becoming focal points for internal putrefaction that would undermine the entire preservation effort. There are documented cases from commoner burials where the viscera was simply pulled out with little regard for identifying or separating them. Instead of individual, carefully prepared canopic jars, which were often made of expensive materials like alabaster or faience, commoners might have had to make do with much simpler, cheaper alternatives. Sometimes, rudimentary pottery vessels, far less ornate and possibly not even specifically designed as canopic jars, were used. In other instances, the desiccated organs, if treated at all, might simply be wrapped into a bundle and placed back inside the body cavity after the desiccation of the torso was complete, or even laid between the legs of the mummy. This practice, while a significant deviation from the ideal, was still considered better than discarding the organs entirely. However, reintroducing semi-preserved or poorly preserved organs into the body cavity could, paradoxically, reintroduce moisture and bacteria, actively hindering the mummification of the torso. In the most impoverished cases, the evisceration and separate treatment of organs were likely skipped altogether. The cost of the embalmer's time, the natron for desiccation, the resins, and even the cheapest set of containers might simply be beyond the family's means. In such scenarios, the organs would be left in situ to decompose naturally within the body during the desiccation process. While the dry desert heat and, if used, external application of natron or even just hot sand might somewhat slow down this internal decay, the presence of moist, bacteria-rich organs within the body cavity was a recipe for disaster in terms of long-term preservation. The body would effectively stew in its own decomposing internal matter, leading to a poorly preserved, often blackened and foul-smelling mummy. The spiritual implications of these compromises must have weighed heavily on the minds of ancient Egyptians. If the organs were seen as essential components of the resurrected self, what did it mean if they were improperly treated, jumbled together, or left to rot? Did this condemn the deceased to an incomplete or diminished existence in the field of reeds? Would they arrive in the afterlife without their full complement of spiritual parts? These were not abstract theological debates for commoners. They were pressing, existential anxieties tied directly to the very tangible, often unpleasant, realities of their funerary practices. Archaeological evidence from commoner cemeteries reveals a wide spectrum of approaches to organ treatment. Some mummies show signs of attempted, albeit crude, evisceration. Others have packets of what appear to be dried organs returned to the torso. Many, particularly from the poorest strata, show no signs of evisceration at all, their abdominal cavities indicating that the organs decayed naturally inside. Sometimes, instead of actual preserved organs, symbolic representations, or even dummy packets filled with mud or sand were placed inside the body, a poignant testament to the desire to adhere to the ritual form even when the substance was unattainable. This evaporation of the careful, ritually charged process of visceral preservation seen in elite burials down to a rushed, compromised, or entirely absent practice for commoners highlights the disturbing disparities in ancient Egyptian society. The very organs believed necessary for a full afterlife became bargaining chips in the cruel economics of death. The hope for a complete and whole eternal self was directly tied to the depth of one's purse. And for many, that meant their journey to the duat began with a body already compromised, its essential inner components subjected to a brutal triage dictated by poverty, a grim foreboding for the trials that awaited them. The critical stage in transforming a perishable human body into an enduring mummy was desiccation, the thorough removal of moisture that would otherwise fuel bacterial growth and decay. For the ancient Egyptians, the primary agent for this process was natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, predominantly sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, harvested from dry lake beds like the Wadi el Natron. Its remarkable drying properties were the cornerstone of successful mummification. However, for the common Egyptian, access to sufficient quantities of quality natron was a significant economic hurdle, often forcing them to rely on less effective and sometimes grimly inadequate substitutes like common sand. In elite mummification, the body, after evisceration and washing, would be entirely covered in a substantial mound of dry natron, often for a period of around 40 days, though sometimes longer. The natron not only drew out water from the tissues through osmosis, but also created an alkaline environment hostile to bacteria and acted as a mild antiseptic. Vast quantities of this salt were required. Estimates suggest hundreds of pounds for a single adult body. The transportation of natron from its remote desert sources to the embalming workshops, and the sheer volume needed, meant it was a relatively expensive commodity, particularly when refined and purified for optimal use. For the commoner, the cost of such abundant natron was frequently prohibitive. Families with meagre resources simply could not afford the outlay for the amounts used in a royal or noble burial. This economic constraint led to a range of distressing compromises. Embalmers catering to the poor might use significantly less natron, perhaps only a thin layer over the body, or reuse natron that had already been employed on previous bodies, diminishing its hygroscopic, moisture-absorbing efficacy and potentially transferring contaminants. The duration of the natron packing might also be drastically shortened from the ideal 40 days to perhaps just a few weeks, or even days, which would be insufficient for complete desiccation, especially of the deeper tissues. When even limited quantities of natron were beyond reach, practitioners and families turned to far grimmer and less effective alternatives. One of the most common was the use of hot desert sand. The deceased might be buried directly in a shallow pit dug into the hot dry sand, often without any prior evisceration. The theory was that the sun-baked sand would draw out moisture and essentially bake the body dry. While it's true that the extreme aridity of the Egyptian desert, particularly in Upper Egypt, could naturally mummify bodies interred in this way, as evidenced by predynastic burials long before complex embalming evolved, relying on this method for a body that had not been emptied of its internal organs was a gamble. The internal decay would often progress faster than the external desiccation, leading to a poorly preserved, often hollowed out husk, or a body that was merely cooked on the outside while putrefying within. Sometimes a combination of minimal natron and sand might be used. The body might be lightly sprinkled with whatever natron could be afforded and then covered with sand. Other desiccants, like sawdust or chaff, might have been employed if available, but their effectiveness would have been far inferior to natron. These substitutes lacked the same dehydrating power and the alkaline, antibacterial properties that made natron so uniquely suited for mummification. The consequences of these compromises were profound and disturbing. Insufficient desiccation was perhaps the single greatest cause of mummification failure. If too much moisture remained in the tissues, bacteria and fungi would inevitably thrive, leading to a return of decay even after the body was wrapped and entombed. The mummy might appear intact on the surface, but beneath the linen wrappings, a slow, insidious decomposition could continue, reducing the once hopeful vessel for the cat and bar into a foul, disintegrating mass. The smell of such failed mummies, if disturbed, would have been horrific. Imagine the anxiety of a family knowing they could not afford the good salt for their loved one. They would entrust the body to an embalmer who promised results with cheaper methods, or they might attempt some form of DIY preservation themselves, relying on folk knowledge and the pitiless heat of the sun. They would wait, hoping that their meagre efforts would be enough, all the while haunted by the fear that they were condemning their relative to oblivion due to their poverty. The spiritual ideal of a perfectly preserved body ready for eternal life clashed harshly with the economic reality, where the very substance required for that preservation was a luxury. This natron divide underscores the cruel stratification of ancient Egyptian society, where the quality of one's eternity was directly correlated with one's earthly wealth. While pharaohs rested in fragrant, natron-dried splendour, commoners were often left to the uncertain mercy of the desert sand, their bodies undergoing a far more precarious and often less dignified transformation. The simple salt, natron, became a powerful symbol of this disparity, a mundane substance that held the key to an idealized afterlife, yet was so often just out of reach for those who toiled at the bottom of Egypt's social pyramid. Their attempts to find substitutes speak volumes about their desperation and the pervasive fear of what lay beyond if the body was not properly cared for. Following the desiccation process, however imperfect it may have been for a commoner, the next crucial step was the wrapping of the body in linen. This was not merely a protective covering, but a deeply symbolic act, transforming the shrunken, desiccated corpse back into a recognizable human form, cocooning it for its journey to the afterlife, and providing surfaces for the application of magical spells and amulets. For the elite, this involved an astonishing quantity of fine, new linen, often hundreds of square yards, meticulously applied in intricate layers by skilled wrappers. For the destitute, however, securing enough suitable linen was another agonizing challenge, often resulting in mummies enveloped in patchwork shrouds pieced together from worn-out domestic textiles, recycled rags, and materials of dubious origin and cleanliness. The ideal linen for mummification was clean, preferably new, and woven specifically for funerary purposes, sometimes inscribed with passages from the Book of the Dead. Different grades of linen were used. from the finest royal linen, byssus, to coarser varieties. The sheer volume required for a high-status burial was immense. Strips of varying widths and lengths were used to individually wrap limbs, fingers, and toes. Then the entire body, building up a thick, resilient cocoon. This layering provided physical protection, helped to maintain the body's shape, and absorbed any remaining bodily fluids or applied resins. For common Egyptians, obtaining such quantities of new linen was an impossibility. Linen production was labour-intensive, from growing the flax to spinning the thread and weaving the cloth. While Egypt was a major linen producer, high-quality textiles were valuable commodities. A poor family, having already potentially exhausted their resources on an embalmer and whatever natron they could afford, would be hard-pressed to find enough clean, intact fabric for an adequate wrapping. This scarcity led to widespread recycling and repurposing of household linens. Worn-out clothing, old bedsheets, discarded sails, and even old loincloths or cleaning rags. Anything made of linen could be pressed into service for the dead. These textiles would often be threadbare, patched, stained from years of use, and far from the ritually pure ideal. Families would gather every scrap they could find. Sometimes, the linen used for wrapping commoner mummies shows clear evidence of its previous life. Seams from old garments, darned holes, and discoloration patterns from everyday wear and tear. The strips used would be of inconsistent quality, size, and even colour, resulting in a far less uniform and aesthetically pleasing wrapping than that of elite mummies. The quality of these recycled linens also had practical implications for preservation. Dirty or soiled linen could introduce bacteria and mould to the desiccated body, potentially reinitiating decomposition. Thin. Worn material offered less physical protection against damage from handling, tomb collapse, or insect infestation. The quantity of linen was also a factor. While elite mummies might have dozens of layers, commoner mummies often had far fewer, sometimes just a single tattered shroud wrapped around them, or a few loosely applied bandages. This meagre covering left the body more vulnerable and did little to restore a sense of human form to the emaciated, dried corpse. The process of wrapping itself, even with limited materials, was intended to be a ritual act. However, without the skilled teams available to the wealthy, the wrapping of a commoner's mummy might be a rushed and haphazard affair, undertaken by family members or the local, less skilled embalmer. The intricate bandaging patterns, designed to provide structural support and a pleasing shape, would be absent. Instead, the linen might simply be wound around the body as best as possible, creating a lumpy, irregular form. Archaeological finds from commoner cemeteries frequently reveal these patchwork mummies. Excavators might unroll a body to find an outer layer of relatively decent, though still used, linen, only to discover that the inner layers consist of a chaotic assemblage of disparate fabric scraps, some no larger than a few inches square, all held together with rough ties or a few turns of coarser cordage. It's a poignant testament to the family's efforts to do their best with what little they had, a desperate attempt to provide the deceased with the dignity and protection afforded by a proper linen encasement. Moreover, there's evidence of an even grimmer trade, the robbing of old, forgotten tombs, not for gold or precious amulets, but for the linen wrappings themselves. These already ancient and potentially contaminated shrouds could be stripped from previously interred bodies and reused for new burials, a macabre form of recycling that highlights the extreme poverty and desperation involved. The thought of a loved one being wrapped in materials scavenged from another, long-forgotten corpse is profoundly unsettling and speaks to the brutal choices faced by the poor. The disparity in linen use is a stark visual indicator of the chasm between rich and poor in their journey to the afterlife. While the pharaoh lay cocooned in layers of pristine sacred cloth, the peasant might be consigned to eternity in little more than the faded, patched remnants of their earthly toil. This scarcity of linen wasn't just an aesthetic issue, it impacted the physical integrity of the mummy, and symbolized, in a very tangible way, the diminished resources and compromised rituals available to the majority of Egypt's population as they sought protection and rebirth in the Duat. Amulets played a vital role in ancient Egyptian funerary beliefs, acting as powerful magical objects designed to protect the deceased, ward off evil spirits, and ensure their safe passage and successful resurrection in the afterlife. The bodies of elite mummies were often adorned with an astonishing array of these charms, crafted from precious materials like gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and faience, each meticulously made, inscribed, and strategically placed within the linen wrappings according to complex ritual prescriptions. For the common Egyptian, however, access to such potent and finely wrought amulets was severely limited. Their journey into eternity was often accompanied by far humbler, mass-produced charms or even symbolic substitutes, reflecting yet another disturbing aspect of how poverty compromised their spiritual defences. The most well-known amulets, such as the heart scarab, the dyad pillar, representing stability, the tayet, Isis knot, for protection, the ujat eye of Horus, for healing and wholeness, and figures of various deities were considered essential for overcoming the perils of the underworld. For the wealthy, these would be custom-made by skilled artisans, imbued with potent magic through precise inscriptions and the inherent qualities of the materials used. Gold, for instance, was associated with the flesh of the gods and eternity, lapis lazuli with the heavens. Commoners, keenly aware of the protective power attributed to these objects, also sought to equip their dead with amulets, but they had to resort to far more affordable options. This led to a thriving industry, producing cheap, mass-produced versions of popular amulets. These were typically made from inexpensive materials like low-quality faience, a glazed ceramic, fired clay, steatite, soapstone, wood, or even moulded mud. The craftsmanship was often crude, the details indistinct, and any inscriptions, if present, might be poorly executed, or even just symbolic scribbles devoid of actual meaning. Faience, while capable of producing beautiful blue and green glazes, was also used in its cheapest forms for these commoner amulets. Moulds were used to churn out hundreds, if not thousands, of identical small charms. Quality control would have been minimal, resulting in amulets that were misshapen, poorly glazed, or easily broken. Clay amulets were even simpler, sometimes little more than roughly shaped and sun-dried pieces of mud, perhaps lightly incised with a symbol. Wooden amulets, while potentially more detailed, were susceptible to rot and insect damage, especially in less than ideal tomb conditions. The placement of these amulets on a commoner's mummy was also likely less precise and ritually guided than in elite burials. While texts like the Book of the Dead stipulated exactly where certain amulets should be located to be effective, e.g., the heart scarab over the heart, a family or a local embalmer, working with limited knowledge and resources, might simply tuck a few available charms into the wrappings wherever seemed appropriate, or even just place a small bag of them with the body. The quantity would also be drastically lower. Instead of dozens or even hundreds of amulets, a commoner might have only a handful, or perhaps just one or two. Sometimes, when even the cheapest manufactured amulets were unaffordable, people resorted to natural objects believed to possess amuletic properties. A uniquely shaped pebble, a fossil, a particular type of shell, or a dried plant might be included with the deceased, imbued with the family's hopes and prayers for protection. There is also evidence of dummy amulets, such as pieces of linen cut into the shape of an amulet, or simple, uninscribed plaques. These poignant substitutes reveal the desperation to adhere to the forms of ritual protection, even when the true, potent objects were out of reach. The spiritual efficacy of these amulets of affordability must have been a source of anxiety. If the power of an amulet was believed to derive from its material, its craftsmanship, and the precision of its inscriptions, what did it mean to enter the underworld, armed only with crude, mass-produced, or symbolic charms? Would these faded protections be strong enough to repel the demons and dangers that lurked on the path to the field of reeds? Would the gods recognize these humble offerings? This disparity in magical armament suggests a disturbing belief, implicit or explicit, that the poor were less well defended in the face of supernatural threats, their souls more vulnerable. Furthermore, the cheap materials made these amulets less durable. While gold and precious stones would survive for millennia, clay and poorly fired faience could easily crumble or degrade, especially in damp or disturbed burials. This meant that even the minimal magical protection afforded to a commoner might not last, leaving them spiritually unarmed over time. The archaeological record of commoner cemeteries often presents a stark contrast to the glittering finds from royal and noble tombs. Instead of exquisite, inlaid pectorals and intricate gold scarabs, excavators find handfuls of small, crudely made faience beads, a few roughly shaped stone charms, or perhaps nothing at all beyond the most basic grave goods. This lack of, or poor quality of, amuletic protection is a silent testament to the profound inequalities that shaped not only life, but also the perceived prospects of death and resurrection for the majority of ancient Egyptians. Their journey to eternity was a pauper's passage, equipped with only the faintest echoes of the potent magic that guided the souls of the powerful. Ritual purity, or WW, was a paramount concept in ancient Egyptian religious practice, and nowhere was it more critical than in the processes surrounding death and mummification. The transformation of the deceased into a divine being, an Osiris, capable of resurrection, demanded that every stage of the embalming and burial be conducted in a state of utmost ritual cleanliness, free from physical and spiritual contamination. For the elite, immense resources were dedicated to maintaining this purity. Specialized waybit, pure places. For embalming, consecrated tools, purified water, natron from sacred sources, and priests who underwent rigorous purification rites. For the common Egyptian, however, achieving, let alone maintaining, such an ideal state of ritual purity throughout the mummification process was an almost insurmountable challenge, leading to a constant fear that their efforts were inherently flawed and spiritually compromised. The very environment in which a commoner's mummification often took place was a primary source of impurity. As previously discussed, embalming might occur in a section of the family's cramped, multi-purpose dwelling, or in a makeshift, open-air shelter on the dusty outskirts of a village. These locations were intrinsically unclean by Egyptian religious standards, exposed to everyday refuse, animal waste, insects, and the general miasma of densely populated settlements. There were no purified floors to prevent contact with the profane earth, no ritually cleansed walls to ward off malevolent influences. The embalmer, likely a local figure of low status and limited training, would not have undergone the elaborate purification ceremonies required of temple priests involved in royal embalming. Their hands, their tools, and even their clothing might carry traces of previous, less than pure work. Water, essential for the initial washing of the body and for cleaning instruments, was another major point of contamination. While elite embalmers might use water specially drawn and consecrated from sacred temple lakes, or the Nile itself during religiously significant periods, commoners would rely on whatever water source was available, often a communal well or canal potentially contaminated with human and animal waste. Washing the deceased with such water, far from purifying them, could introduce further impurities and bacteria. The materials used were also problematic. Natron, even if affordable, might not be of the purest grade. Linen, as we've seen, was often recycled, bearing the residues of its previous life. Any resins or oils used to anoint the body would likely be cheaper, adulterated versions of the fine, imported substances used for the wealthy, their ritual efficacy questionable. Even the offerings intended to sustain the deceased in the afterlife, modest portions of bread, beer or dates, might be prepared in ordinary, non-sanctified household conditions. The process of evisceration, if performed, was fraught with potential for ritual defilement. In elite practice, the incision was ideally made by a slicer, paraschist, who was then often ritually chased away and stoned, symbolically taking the blame for marring the body of Osiris. This ritual act helped to contain the impurity associated with opening the corpse. For commoners, such elaborate symbolic safeguards were unlikely. The same individual who made the cut likely handled the organs and continued the embalming with little to no formal ritual to mitigate the violence done to the body. The handling and disposal of the extracted viscera, if not properly contained or ritually managed, could also be a source of impurity. Furthermore, the constant presence of death and disease in poorer communities created an atmosphere where maintaining ritual purity was a continuous struggle. If multiple deaths occurred in close succession, or if the embalmer was handling several bodies with limited resources, the risk of cross-contamination, both physically and spiritually, was high. The ideal was a singular focus on transforming this specific individual into a pure divine being, a focus almost impossible to achieve in the crowded, resource-scarce context of commoner death. This inability to achieve the ideal state of ritual purity would have been a source of deep anxiety for the grieving family. They were steeped in a religious culture that emphasized the dire consequences of impurity for the deceased's prospects in the afterlife. Failure to purify the body and its surroundings could anger the gods, attract malevolent spirits, or render the entire mummification process ineffective, leaving the soul of their loved one vulnerable and unable to complete its journey. Every shortcut taken due to poverty, every compromised material, every less than sacred action would have felt like a step further away from the blessed resurrection they so desperately desired for the deceased. They might try to compensate with simple household rituals, burning incense, if they could afford it, reciting whatever prayers or protective spells they knew, or appealing to local deities for intercession. But these efforts would always be overshadowed by the knowledge that they were falling short of the standards set by the powerful and the pious. The grand funerary texts, like the Book of the Dead, described a pristine, icon, intect path to the afterlife, achieved through perfect ritual action. The commoner's path was, by necessity, littered with impurities and compromises. The disturbing truth is that the very conditions of poverty made true ritual purity, as defined by the Egyptian religious elite, an unattainable dream for most. Their attempts at mummification, born of profound love and desperate hope, were almost always desecrated from the start by the inescapable realities of their socio-economic position. This wasn't a willful neglect of religious duty, but a tragic consequence of a system where access to divine favour and a safe passage to eternity was intrinsically linked to earthly wealth and status, leaving the vast majority to contend with the spiritual burden of an imperfect, and therefore precarious, transition. The final resting place of an ancient Egyptian was of paramount importance, intended to be an eternal house that would protect the mummy and its grave goods, and serve as a focal point for the funerary cult that would sustain the deceased's car in the afterlife. For pharaohs and nobles, this meant magnificent, deeply cut rock tombs, elaborately decorated mastabas, or even pyramids situated in exclusive necropolises like the Valley of the Kings or Saqqara. For the common Egyptian, however, burial was a far cry from such splendour. They were typically interred in crowded, simple pit graves, often located in marginal areas of the desert, with little or no permanent marking, leaving their mummies vulnerable to the elements, animal scavengers, accidental disturbance, and the ever-present threat of being utterly forgotten, a second, more terrifying death. Commoner cemeteries were usually situated on the arid desert fringe, just beyond the cultivated lands, as arable land was too precious to be used for burials. These areas were often less stable geologically than the sites chosen for elite tombs. Flash floods, though rare in the desert, could occur, washing away shallow graves and exposing their contents. Wind erosion was a constant factor, gradually scouring away the sand and any superficial grave markers, leaving mummies and their meagre possessions scattered on the surface. The graves themselves were typically simple pits, just large enough to accommodate the body, which might be placed directly in the sand, sometimes on a reed mat, or, if the family could afford it, within a rudimentary wooden coffin or a container made of pottery or reeds. Unlike the deep shafts and sealed chambers of elite tombs, these shallow graves offered minimal protection. Jackals and other desert scavengers, drawn by the scent of decomposition, especially from imperfectly mummified bodies, could easily dig up and scatter the remains. The image of a loved one's body being desecrated in such a way would have been a source of profound horror and grief for the family. Overcrowding was another significant issue in commoner cemeteries. With limited suitable land available for burial over generations, graves were often dug very close together, sometimes even cutting into earlier burials. This resulted in a chaotic jumble of remains, where the bones of multiple individuals might become commingled. The integrity of individual burials was frequently compromised, making it difficult, if not impossible, for later generations to identify and venerate specific ancestors. This lack of distinct individual space contrasted sharply with the expansive, well-defined funerary estates of the wealthy. Perhaps most distressingly, these commoner graves were rarely marked in any permanent or substantial way. While elite tombs bore inscriptions detailing the name and titles of the deceased, ensuring their identity would be remembered, commoner graves might have only a simple stone, a small pile of rocks, or a crude wooden marker that would quickly decay or be displaced. Sometimes there was no marker at all. This lack of enduring identification meant that within a generation or two, the exact location of an ancestor's grave, and thus their very memory, could be lost. To be forgotten was, in the Egyptian worldview, a terrible fate, as the continued existence of the ka depended on its name being spoken and offerings being made. An unmarked grave was a swift path to oblivion. The few grave goods interred with commoners, a pot or two containing food for the afterlife, a cherished personal item, a few cheap amulets, also offered little in terms of identification or long-term remembrance. These humble possessions were easily broken or lost when graves were disturbed. The poignant hope invested in these small tokens, that they might comfort and sustain the deceased, was often cruelly undone by the precarity of their burial. This lack of secure, identifiable burial also meant that the concept of an ongoing funerary cult, so vital for the elite, was largely unfeasible for commoners. While families might try to visit the general area of their ancestors' burials and make offerings, pinpointing the exact grave of a great-grandparent in a sprawling, unmarked desert cemetery would be nearly impossible. This practical difficulty in maintaining a direct connection with the deceased further increased the likelihood of their being forgotten by the living and thus perishing in the afterlife. The disturbing reality for most ancient Egyptians was that their eternal house was likely to be a shallow, unmarked hole in the sand, offering scant protection from the harsh realities of the desert and the fading memories of future generations. While the colossal tombs of the pharaohs proclaimed their owners' names to eternity, the vast majority of Egyptians were laid to rest in anonymity, their final hope for remembrance and a continued existence resting on the most fragile of foundations. This marginalization in death, this consignment to crowded and forgotten graves, was a final, brutal reflection of their social and economic standing in life. The ever-present threat of oblivion, of their identity and memory being erased by the shifting sands, was perhaps the most chilling aspect of a commoner's funerary prospects. Ancient Egyptian religious texts and elite funerary art paint a vivid picture of a successful afterlife, a well-preserved body, a triumphant judgment, and an eternity of bliss in the field of reeds. This was the ideal, underwritten by elaborate mummification, potent spells, and well-stocked tombs. But for the common Egyptian, whose experience of the mummification process was fraught with compromise, scarcity, and corner-cutting, a deeply unsettling question must have loomed. Did they genuinely believe their substandard preparations would actually work? Or were they clinging to a fragile hope, masking a terrifying suspicion that their efforts were insufficient for true, high-quality immortality? The chasm between the prescribed rituals and the reality of their practices was immense. They knew, from observation or rumour, the care and resources lavished on the burials of the wealthy. They would have seen or heard about the extensive desiccation with copious natron, the meticulous organ removal and preservation in canopic jars, the wrapping in vast quantities of fine linen, and the provisioning of rich grave goods and powerful amulets. Against this backdrop, their own efforts, a body perhaps only partially desiccated with sand, organs left in situ or crudely handled, wrappings of recycled rags, and a few cheap clay amulets, must have seemed woefully inadequate. This awareness likely fostered a complex psychological state. On one hand, the belief in an afterlife and the necessity of bodily preservation was so deeply ingrained in the Egyptian psyche, from the highest echelons of society to the humblest peasant, that to abandon it entirely would have been almost unthinkable. It was the very fabric of their understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. Hope, therefore, was a powerful, tenacious force. Families would have poured their emotions, their meagre savings, and their sincerest prayers into even the most rudimentary of funerary rites, desperately hoping that the gods would recognize their intentions, if not the perfection of their execution. However, this hope must have coexisted with a gnawing doubt, a spectre of second-rate immortality. If the elite, with all their resources, were still subject to the judgment of Osiris and the perils of the Duat, what chance did a poorly preserved commoner, with minimal magical protection, truly stand? Did they imagine a different kind of afterlife for themselves, less glorious, perhaps more precarious, than that envisioned for the pharaohs? Or did they fear that their compromised mummification would lead to a diminished existence, perhaps as a restless spirit, unable to fully achieve beatification, or even facing outright annihilation if their body failed to endure? The proliferation of dummy elements in commoner burials, fake canopic jars, symbolic amulets made of mud, or even just drawings of offerings, suggests a poignant awareness of their inability to meet the ideal. These were not attempts to deceive the gods, but rather a desperate effort to fulfill the form of the rituals when the substance was lacking. It's as if they were saying, "We know what is required, and though we cannot provide it, we acknowledge the necessity and offer this humble substitute as a token of our faith and devotion." Such practices hint at a tacit understanding that their preparations were a shadow of the real thing, a hope pinned on divine compassion rather than ritual efficacy. Moreover, the practical outcomes of commoner mummification were often visibly inferior. If a previous family member's mummy had decayed rapidly despite their best efforts, or if grave robbers had easily plundered a shallow grave, such experiences would have served as stark, tangible reminders of the fragility of their hold on eternity. They would have witnessed firsthand the failure of their methods, fueling their anxieties about the fate of their newly deceased loved ones. It's unlikely that commoners openly expressed skepticism about the core tenets of their faith. The social and religious pressure to conform was immense. But private doubts, unspoken fears, and a pervasive sense of spiritual inadequacy must have been widespread. They might have placed more emphasis on the moral character of the deceased, hoping that a good life might compensate for a poor burial in the eyes of Osiris. Or they may have relied more heavily on the intercession of local deities, family ancestral spirits, or even the mercy of the gods of the underworld, hoping for a leniency not typically emphasized in the formal religious doctrines that catered to the elite. This psychological burden, the need to believe in an afterlife, while simultaneously understanding the shortcomings of one's own preparations for it, is a deeply disturbing aspect of the commoner experience. It speaks to a constant negotiation between faith and harsh reality, between the promise of eternal life and the ever-present threat that this promise was contingent on resources they simply did not possess. They were caught in a spiritual bind, striving for an eternity that the very structure of their society made disproportionately difficult to achieve. The spectre of a failed or inferior afterlife, directly linked to their socio-economic status, was a quiet torment that underscored the profound inequities of the ancient Egyptian world, extending far beyond the realm of the living. The practice of tomb robbing in ancient Egypt was as old as tomb building itself, a persistent shadow hanging over every burial, from the grandest pyramid to the humblest pit grave. While the plundering of royal and elite tombs, with their fabled treasures of gold, silver, and precious artifacts, often captures the historical imagination, the robbing of commoner graves was also a grim and pervasive reality. Though these modest burials offered scant material reward, their very simplicity and lack of protection made them exceptionally easy targets, subjecting the deceased and their grieving families to further desecration and despair. Elite tombs were designed with security in mind, albeit often ineffectively. They featured deep shafts, hidden chambers, stone sarcophagi, heavy blocking stones, and sometimes even decoy passages or curses intended to deter intruders. Protecting these tombs was often the responsibility of dedicated necropolis guards. In stark contrast, commoner graves, typically shallow pits in the desert sand, offered virtually no physical resistance to a determined robber. There were no sealed doors to break through, no heavy stones to move, no complex layouts to navigate. A few minutes of digging with rudimentary tools, or even bare hands, was often all it took to reach the interred body. The lack of substantial or permanent grave markers also made commoner cemeteries vulnerable. While this anonymity might seem like a defence, it also meant that there was less communal oversight or specific attachment to individual plots once the immediate grieving period passed. A robber could operate with a greater sense of impunity in a sprawling, unmarked commoner necropolis than in a well-guarded and clearly delineated elite burial ground. The sheer number and density of commoner graves meant that any single act of desecration was less likely to be noticed or investigated with the same urgency as an intrusion into a noble's tomb. But why would anyone bother to rob graves that contained so little of material value? The motivations were varied. Firstly, even the poorest burials might contain something that a destitute robber could find useful or could sell for a pittance. A few pottery vessels, even if plain, could be repurposed. A simple copper tool or a piece of worn jewellery, while not intrinsically valuable, might still be worth stealing for someone with nothing. The linen wrappings themselves, as discussed, were a commodity, especially if they were relatively intact and could be reused for other burials or even domestic purposes. Even the mummified bodies, particularly if there was a belief they possessed magical properties or could be ground down for medicinal, albeit gruesome and ineffective, concoctions in later periods, might be targeted. Secondly, sheer desperation and opportunism played a significant role. Tomb robbing was a crime often committed by those on the margins of society, driven by poverty and hunger. For such individuals, even the slimmest chance of finding something of value was worth the minimal effort required to excavate a shallow grave. The risk was relatively low compared to attempting to breach a well-guarded elite tomb. Furthermore, some tomb robbing might not have been purely for material gain, but could also involve malicious desecration, perhaps stemming from local feuds or a desire to inflict harm on the spirit of the deceased or their surviving family. While harder to prove, the act of disturbing the dead was a profound violation in Egyptian culture, and could be a potent, albeit horrifying, way to settle scores. The consequences of tomb robbing for commoner burials were devastating, both practically and spiritually. The robbers, in their haste, would show no respect for the deceased. Bodies would be roughly pulled from their graves, wrappings torn apart, and limbs broken or scattered in the search for anything valuable. Any meagre grave goods would be pocketed, and the remains often left exposed to the elements and scavengers, undoing whatever imperfect mummification had been achieved. This physical destruction of the body was believed to directly imperil the deceased's afterlife, potentially destroying the vessel needed for the car and bar. For the families, discovering that a loved one's grave had been violated would have been a traumatic and heartbreaking experience. Not only was it a personal affront and a sign of profound disrespect, but it also reignited all their anxieties about the deceased's spiritual well-being. The thought that their relative was now homeless in the afterlife, their body desecrated and their meagre provisions stolen, would have been a source of immense grief and guilt, perhaps even fear of retribution from an unappeased spirit. While commoner graves offered less reward in terms of treasure, they presented an irresistible combination of low risk and easy access for those driven by desperation or malice. The very poverty that characterized their lives and burials also made them exceptionally vulnerable in death. The quiet, humble cemeteries on the desert edge, far from being peaceful havens for the departed, were often scenes of callous plunder, a grim reminder that even in the afterlife, the poor were not safe from the predations and hardships that mirrored their earthly existence. This constant threat of violation added another layer of disturbing uncertainty to the already precarious journey of the common Egyptian soul. The primary goal of mummification, regardless of the resources invested, was to halt the natural process of decomposition and preserve the body as a recognizable vessel for the spirit. While elite embalming techniques, with their meticulous attention to detail and ample use of high-quality materials, often achieved remarkable and lasting preservation, the compromise methods used for commoners frequently fell short. When these efforts failed, and decay inevitably prevailed over preservation, the results were profoundly disturbing, both physically and spiritually, creating a lingering horror for those involved and a grim testament to the inadequacies of their funerary practices. Failure in commoner mummification could occur at various stages and for numerous reasons. Insufficient desiccation due to a lack of natron or reliance on ineffective methods like sand burial was a primary culprit. If too much moisture remained in the tissues, especially within the body cavity if organs were not removed or were poorly treated, bacteria and fungi would thrive once the, often minimal, preservative effects wore off. This meant that even a body that appeared reasonably dry and wrapped could begin to decompose from within. The use of recycled or unclean linens could introduce new microbial agents to the already vulnerable body. Inadequate sealing of the body wrappings or the use of rudimentary coffins, if any, that offered little protection from humidity or insects further compounded the problem. In the damp conditions of a poorly sited grave, or one subject to occasional flooding, a commoner mummy could quickly become a soggy, putrefying mess. The physical manifestations of failed mummification were grotesque and sensorially offensive. Instead of a dry, stable mummy, the body would become soft, discoloured, and swollen with the gases of renewed putrefaction. Skin might slip, and tissues could liquefy. The smell would be overpowering and deeply offensive, a potent, cloying miasma of decay that would be impossible to ignore if the grave was disturbed, or if the odours leached into the surrounding environment, particularly in crowded burial grounds. This lingering odour of imperfection was a stark, olfactory confirmation that the desired transformation had not been achieved, and that the forces of corruption had triumphed. Insects, such as flesh flies and coffin beetles, would be drawn to such decaying remains, their larvae feasting on the softened tissues and accelerating the disintegration. The once human form would be reduced to a chaotic assemblage of bone, putrid flesh, and insect casings, a horrifying antithesis to the serene, eternal image of the idealized mummy. Archaeological excavations of commoner cemeteries sometimes unearth these tragic failures. Bodies that are little more than skeletal remains within tattered, mould-ridden wrappings or dark, viscous stains in the sand, where a body once lay, having almost completely decomposed. For the ancient Egyptians, such a failure was not just a practical problem, it was a spiritual catastrophe. The belief that the Ka and Ba needed to recognize and reunite with a preserved physical form meant that a decaying or disintegrated body jeopardized the deceased's very chance at an afterlife. If the body was unrecognizable, how could the soul find its anchor? How could it receive nourishment from offerings or participate in the regenerative cycles of Osiris? The image of a loved one's body succumbing to this ultimate decay, despite the family's best efforts, would have been a source of profound religious terror and despair. It's conceivable that families might have become aware of such failures. Perhaps a grave was shallow and the odour became noticeable, or later burials in the same area inadvertently disturbed an earlier, poorly preserved interment. Discovering a loved one in such a state would have been a horrifying affirmation of their deepest fears, that their poverty, their inability to afford the proper rites, had condemned the deceased to oblivion or some wretched, restless existence. This would have engendered feelings of guilt, helplessness, and perhaps even anger at a cosmic order that seemed so heavily skewed in favour of the wealthy. The knowledge that mummification could fail, and often did fail for people of their standing, must have cast a long shadow over funerary preparations. Every compromise made, every shortcut taken, would have been weighed against the terrifying possibility of such a gruesome outcome. It added a layer of desperate urgency to their efforts, but also a sense of grim fatalism. They did what they could, prayed to the gods for mercy, and then had to live with the uncertainty and the potential for a truly disturbing end to their loved one's earthly journey. The failed mummies of commoners, therefore, are more than just archaeological curiosities. They are potent symbols of the harsh realities of life and death for the majority in ancient Egypt. They represent the limits of human endeavour in the face of poverty, the stark contrast between religious ideal and material constraint, and the deeply unsettling fear that, for many, the promise of eternity was just an illusion, easily consumed by the inexorable and unforgiving processes of natural decay. The lingering odour of imperfection was a constant, grim reminder of their vulnerability, both in this life and, terrifyingly, in the next. The story of commoner mummies doesn't end with their often precarious interment. Many centuries later, with the rise of Egyptology and the burgeoning Western interest in ancient Egyptian antiquities, these humble remains faced a new set of indignities. While the tombs of pharaohs and nobles were excavated with great fanfare, their occupants often treated with a degree of reverence, at least initially. Commoner mummies, when encountered, were frequently misunderstood, undervalued, and subjected to treatment that was disrespectful at best and destructive at worst. Their fate in the hands of early archaeologists and collectors adds another layer to the disturbing narrative of their existence. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the focus of many archaeological expeditions was overwhelmingly on discovering monumental architecture, royal inscriptions, and museum-worthy treasures. Commoner cemeteries, often lacking such grand finds, were either overlooked or excavated with far less care and systematic rigour than elite sites. When commoner mummies were unearthed, they were often seen as less scientifically or historically significant than their royal counterparts. Their humble grave goods, a few pots, some beads, were deemed unexciting compared to the gold and lapis lazuli of Tutankhamun's tomb. This perception led to a range of unfortunate outcomes. Sometimes, commoner mummies were simply reburied or discarded after a cursory examination deemed not worthy of further study or museum space. If their state of preservation was poor, which was often the case, they might be dismissed as mere skeletal remains or badly mummified specimens, with little attempt made to understand the socio-economic factors behind their condition. The nuanced story of their struggle for preservation was lost, overshadowed by a preference for the perfect mummies of the elite. Worse still, commoner mummies, being more numerous and accessible, were sometimes treated as expendable commodities. They were disinterred in large numbers to fuel the burgeoning international market for Egyptian antiquities, however ghoulish. Some were ground down to produce mumia, a pigment used by European artists, or, more horrifically, sold as ingredients for quack medicinal powders believed to possess healing properties. A grim echo of ancient superstitions. Unwrapped in public spectacles, or mummy unwrapping parties, became a bizarre form of entertainment in Victorian society, with commoner mummies often chosen for these events due to their relative expendability. The scientific value of these unwrappings was often dubious, serving more as a macabre thrill for attendees than a careful investigation. Even when collected for supposed scientific study, their treatment could be shockingly cavalier. Heads might be removed for craniometric study without regard for the integrity of the individual. Mummies might be sawn in half to examine internal structures, or dissected with little of the care afforded to modern bioarchaeological research. The focus was often on typologies and broad racial classifications rather than understanding the individual life and death experience. The stories of hardship, compromise, and desperate hope encapsulated in these humble remains were rarely given voice. This lack of understanding and respect stemmed partly from the prevailing colonial attitudes of the era, where the remains of non-European peoples were often viewed as curiosities or raw data rather than as the bodies of individuals deserving of dignity. It also reflected an archaeological bias towards the great men and great events of history, with less interest in the daily lives and struggles of ordinary people. The narrative of ancient Egypt was being written largely through the lens of its kings and nobles, and the commoner mummy, in its often imperfect state, didn't fit neatly into this heroic narrative. As a result, vast amounts of potential information about the health, diet, burial practices, and social conditions of the majority of ancient Egyptians were lost during this period. The very mummies that could have told the most compelling stories about resilience in the face of adversity, about the true cost of societal inequality, were often the ones most carelessly handled or dismissed. The disturbing world of mummification for ancient Egyptian commoners was thus compounded by a disturbingly dismissive attitude from those who later rediscovered them. It is only in more recent decades, with the advent of more sensitive archaeological techniques, advanced bioarchaeology, and a greater academic focus on social history and the lives of non-elites, that commoner mummies have begun to receive the nuanced study they deserve. Modern researchers now approach these remains with questions about demography, disease patterns, economic stress, and the diversity of religious practice, recognizing that these humble bodies hold invaluable keys to understanding the full spectrum of ancient Egyptian society in all its complexity and its often brutal inequality. The fate of commoner mummies in early archaeology serves as a sobering reminder of how easily the stories of the marginalized can be erased, even by those ostensibly seeking to uncover the past. Beyond the physical toil and economic strain of providing even a rudimentary mummification, ancient Egyptian commoner families endured a profound and often unspoken psychological burden. They were trapped in a distressing bind, deeply committed to a religious belief system that demanded elaborate and expensive funerary rites for a successful afterlife, yet acutely aware of their inability to meet these exacting standards for their deceased loved ones. This disparity fostered a heavy emotional toll, a mixture of grief, guilt, anxiety, and a quiet desperation that permeated their experience of death and mourning. Grief, of course, is a universal human response to loss. But for commoner Egyptians, this natural sorrow was compounded by intense religious anxieties. The death of a family member was not just an emotional blow, it was the urgent commencement of a spiritual crisis. They believed that the deceased's eternal fate hung in the balance, and that the responsibility for ensuring a smooth transition to the afterlife rested heavily on their shoulders. Every decision made, every corner cut due to poverty, became a potential point of failure, a potential condemnation of their loved one. Imagine the conversations, whispered in the dim light of a mud brick hut, as a family debated how to afford even a small quantity of natron, or whether they could spare enough old linen for a decent wrapping. Could they afford the services of the local embalmer, however unskilled he might be, or would they have to attempt the gruesome task themselves? These were not abstract discussions. They were choices laden with immense spiritual weight. The father who could not provide a proper burial for his child, or the children who knew their parents' mummification was substandard, would have carried a heavy sense of inadequacy and failure. This sense of guilt would have been pervasive. Egyptian culture emphasized filial piety and the duty of the living to care for the dead. Funerary texts and tomb depictions, primarily of the elite, but setting the cultural standard, showcased elaborate rituals and abundant offerings. Commoners, constantly exposed to these ideals through religious festivals, stories, or glimpses of elite processions, would have felt their own shortcomings keenly. They might have asked themselves, "Have I done enough? Will my mother, father, child suffer in the dua because of my poverty? Will their spirit return to haunt us, dissatisfied with their meagre provisions?" Anxiety about the deceased's judgment before Osiris would have been magnified. If the body was poorly preserved, if essential amulets were missing, if the correct spells were not recited, perhaps because no one in the family was literate or could afford a lector priest, how could the deceased hope to pass the trials of the underworld? This anxiety was not just for the departed. There was also a fear that an improperly tended spirit could become a malevolent force, bringing misfortune upon the surviving family. Thus, their attempts at mummification were driven not only by love and hope, but also by a very real fear of the supernatural consequences of failure. The very act of witnessing or participating in a compromised mummification process would have been deeply unsettling. Seeing a loved one's body handled crudely, or knowing it was being preserved with inadequate materials, or interred in a shallow, unmarked grave, would have been a constant, visceral reminder of their inability to provide the idealized, good death. This could lead to a form of prolonged, complicated grief, where the mourning process was intertwined with persistent worries about the deceased's spiritual state. There was likely little social support for these specific anxieties outside the immediate family, or perhaps close neighbours experiencing similar struggles. While the community might share in the initial mourning, the deeper spiritual anxieties related to the quality of the burial were a more private burden. Priests associated with state temples were largely concerned with elite cults and less accessible for comforting the everyday spiritual concerns of the poor regarding funerary inadequacies. To cope, families might have intensified their private piety, making more frequent, humble offerings at local shrines, or clinging to folk beliefs and magical practices that promised some measure of protection or divine favour outside the formal, expensive religious system. They might have told themselves stories of merciful gods who understood their plight, or focused on the moral rectitude of the deceased as a compensating factor. But these coping mechanisms would always exist alongside the stark knowledge of their material shortcomings. This psychological burden reveals the deeply human side of the disturbing world of commoner mummification. It wasn't just about the gruesome details of decay or the lack of resources. It was about the emotional suffering of ordinary people trying to navigate an unforgiving religious and social system. They loved their families and yearned for their eternal well-being, but were continually confronted by their inability to provide the culturally prescribed means to achieve it. This quiet anguish, this tension between profound faith and harsh reality, was perhaps one of the heaviest loads the common Egyptian had to bear when facing the inevitability of death. The study of commoner mummies, with all their imperfections, their tales of scarcity, and the compromises etched into their very preservation, offers a profound and often unsettling corrective to the sanitized, gilded image of ancient Egypt that so often dominates popular perception. These humble remains, dredged from the forgotten sands, are not mere relics of a bygone era, they are crucial witnesses. They speak volumes about the vast social and economic chasms that characterized Egyptian society, the everyday hardships faced by the majority, and the deeply ingrained spiritual anxieties that permeated life and death beyond the opulent courts of pharaohs and the serene temple precincts. These echoes from the sand reveal a dark underside to a magnificent civilization, a world of struggle largely unrecorded in the grand hieroglyphic inscriptions. The most immediate revelation from commoner mummies is the stark reality of social stratification. While the official rhetoric might speak of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice, and the pharaoh as a shepherd to his people, the material evidence of funerary practices paints a picture of extreme inequality. The chasm between a pharaoh entombed in a mountain of stone, their body meticulously preserved with the finest materials and surrounded by dazzling wealth, and a peasant, hastily buried in a shallow pit, with little more than a few rags and a clay pot, is a stark testament to a society where one's earthly status directly determined the perceived quality of one's eternity. This wasn't just about differing levels of comfort in the afterlife. It was about the fundamental ability to access what was culturally defined as the means to that afterlife. The state of preservation itself, or lack thereof, in commoner mummies, tells a story of resource scarcity and the constant struggle for survival. Evidence of malnutrition, arrested growth, Harris lines in bones, endemic parasitic infections, and healed, or unhealed, injuries from hard labour are frequently found in these remains. Their bodies bear the marks of a life spent toiling, often in harsh conditions with inadequate nutrition and sanitation. The compromises made in their mummification, the insufficient natron, the recycled linen, the crude amulets, are direct reflections of this lifelong economic precarity. They simply could not afford the luxury of a proper burial as defined by the elite. Furthermore, the sheer variety in commoner burial practices, from relatively well-preserved bodies in simple coffins to skeletons with almost no signs of artificial mummification, highlights not only different levels of poverty, but also regional variations, and perhaps shifting beliefs or access to practitioners over time. This diversity contrasts with the more standardized, though evolving, funerary rituals of the elite. It suggests a more ad hoc, pragmatic approach to death among the general populace, driven by immediate needs and available resources, rather than rigid adherence to a complex, centrally dictated doctrine. These humble mummies also illuminate the immense psychological pressure exerted by the dominant religious ideology. The pervasive fear of oblivion and the desperate hope for resurrection drove families to extraordinary lengths, even with their limited means. The poignant attempts to replicate elite practices, the dummy canopic jars, the symbolic offerings, speak of a population deeply invested in the religious framework, yet painfully aware of their inability to fully participate in its ideal forms. This creates a picture of a society where spiritual well-being was, in many ways, a commodity, accessible in its fullness only to those who could pay the price. By studying commoner mummies, we move beyond the monumental propaganda of the state and gain insights into the lived religion of ordinary people, their fears, their hopes, their attempts to reconcile profound faith with grinding poverty. We see evidence of folk practices, local traditions, and perhaps a more direct, less mediated relationship with the divine, born of necessity. Their graves are not filled with texts detailing their theological beliefs, but their very bones and the manner of their burial are inscribed with the story of their spiritual lives. In essence, the humblest mummies force us to confront the less glamorous, more brutal aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization. They remind us that behind the magnificent temples and the golden masks lay a vast population whose daily existence was often a struggle, and whose preparations for eternity were fraught with compromise and anxiety. These forgotten individuals, their bodies imperfectly preserved and their graves often unmarked, provide a vital counterbalance to the elite narrative. Their echoes from the sand tell us that the true measure of a civilization lies not just in its grandest achievements, but also in how it cared for its most vulnerable, both in life and in their preparations for death. The disturbing world of commoner mummification is, therefore, an essential, if sobering, chapter in the long and complex story of ancient Egypt, revealing the resilience, the faith, and the profound suffering of those who formed the backbone of that extraordinary society.